Hello and welcome, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you joining me this afternoon. Just going to give it a little moment for everyone to sign in, but please do feel free to say hello in the chat while you're waiting. If you want to let us know where you're joining us from, that would be great. We'll get started in just a second. A whole stream of messages coming in. Wonderful. So thank you all for saying hi, and great to see so many people from so many different countries. I'm going to kick off with a bit of an introduction first. So welcome to the WSET Bitesize How Wine is Made webinar. Just as a bit of an introduction to WSET for anyone who does not yet know, WSET is the leading provider of qualifications for wine, spirits and sake around the world. We are currently based in 70 different countries with over 800 course providers and in 15 different languages. So it's pretty impressive all in all. This session is going to be recorded, so for anyone who has to leave, don't worry, you will be able to find it on YouTube afterwards, along with all the other recordings of the other sessions that have been done already. For anyone that has questions as we go along, please do pop them in the Q&A, and I will do my very best to answer those at the end. And just as an introduction to myself, my name is Julia Lambeth. I'm one of the full-time educators at WSET School London, where I teach the wine courses across levels 1 to 4. I've been a full-time educator there for just over 4 years. I've been an independent educator for a few years before that. So I've been around teaching WSET for quite some time now. So today we are looking at how wine is made. I've got a few slides we're just going to go through and talk about the different stages and different types of production. So we're going to start with what is wine? So to understand how wine is made, we need to know what we're talking about in the first place. So wine here, we are talking about the product of fermented grape juice. And you can see a lovely picture of some grapes there. So in particular, when we're talking about wine, it is this grape-based wine. You may have had wines from other fruits before, but that's not quite what we're going to be talking about here. Wine from grapes has been around for many thousands of years. So it's a really historical product in a lot of different countries. We can find hundreds of different grape varieties in many different countries around the world. So I'm imagining you're all here because you have some connection to wine. When we're talking about grapes, we have a broad distinction of white grapes, which are those mainly used to make white wine, which is again the picture you can see on the slide. But we also have black grapes. So those are the ones that are more purple in colour and are normally used to make red wines instead. In terms of the wines that we're going to talk about, we're going to have a brief run through the processes for making white wine, red wine and rosé wine. So these are the main categories we're going to talk about. You may well have come across some other styles of wine. For example, you might have heard of orange wine before. We're not going to touch on that too much today, but actually one of my colleagues, Anjali, has made a webinar about that previously, so do check that out. And neither are we going to touch on sparkling or fortified wines, which are separate styles. So focusing on still wines in those styles instead. Now, the first thing we need to be aware of is alcoholic fermentation. So this is the process by which all wines are made. So here we have sugary grapes. So when we harvest our grapes, which is normally going to be in autumn, inside the grapes, we're going to have a nice amount of sugar. And it is this sugar which the yeast is going to eat and turn into alcohol. Alcohol is the bit that we are looking for. Yeast themselves are microorganisms. These can exist readily in the vineyard or in the winery, or they can be added by the winemaker. So we've got a bit of an option there. The alcohol that we are going to get is going to vary according to how much sugar we have in the grapes to start with. So the more sugar we have, it can lead to more alcohol in the wine. You can see here that another product of fermentation is carbon dioxide. So in most wines, carbon dioxide is not needed, and so this can just be left to dissipate. The main exception to that is going to be sparkling wines, where that carbon dioxide can be used to make the wines bubbly, but as I mentioned, we're not going to go into detail on that today. There are two other things that are byproducts of fermentation. First off, we have heat. Heat doesn't necessarily get used for fermentation, but we may need to be mindful that if the fermentation gets warm, it could maybe lose some of the more delicate flavors. So particularly for white wines, we may then control the temperature of the fermentation. And the other thing that we will get is flavors, all the different flavors that you can find in wines. Some of them will be the byproduct of fermentation. So this could be things like fruity flavors. We often talk about things like cherries or lemons, apples, depending on the grape variety and where it's come from. But you can also get floral notes or spicy notes or herbaceous notes. Many different flavors are possible. Now, what I find interesting about this is that you will notice that it's actually pretty rare for wine to actually taste like grapes. If you think about all the wines you've tried, you can taste many different fruits, but rarely is it grapes. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about wine. It can taste like pretty much anything. And if you compare that to some of your other fruit-based beverages, you don't necessarily get these same variations. So it's one of the things that makes wine interesting. Now, what we're going to do as we talk through the different ways of making white wine, red wine, and rosé wine is talk a lot about choices. So when it comes to making a wine, the winemaker has many different things that they can do at different stages that are going to determine the final style and quality of the wine. In theory, winemaker could just leave all the grapes in a bucket and like fermentation would happen. A wine would be made, but it would not be the best wine in the world. So in order to control that process and to make sure we're getting the best of the grapes, that's where all these little choices are going to come into play. So we're going to start by talking about white wines. So white wines normally made from white grapes, and you'll probably know some white grape varieties already. Things like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc are some of the more famous varieties from around the world. However, it is not impossible to make a white wine from black grapes as well. The key here is that the inside of both grapes doesn't have any color. So if we are making a white wine, we are actually keeping just the juice and not the skins. So by doing that, we can make a white wine from both white grapes and black grapes. Now, there aren't many places around the world that have a tradition of making white wines from black grapes, but there is one place that's quite famous that you've probably come across, which is Champagne. So sparkling wine in Champagne, we have 3 grape varieties that are commonly used there. 2 of them are black grapes, even for the white wines. So that's always a little interesting potential option. Now then, if we go into the process in a little bit more detail, the first stage you can see here is crushing. Crushing is the term that means essentially splitting the skins, releasing the juice from the berries. And from here, we're going to go straight into pressing. Pressing is the term that means separating the skins from the juice. As we were saying, in a white wine fermentation, we actually don't want to keep those skins. So this is the stage at which we can remove them. The picture you can see here shows you a basket press. How this would work is the grapes go on the inside. There's a plate that comes down from above and squashes them, essentially. The skins will stay on the inside, but the juice can come out in the gaps between those little wooden slats. So you can collect the juice separately, and then that's going to be ready for the next stage, which is alcoholic fermentation. So we've got our juice, we've discarded the skins, our juice has sugar in it, it is ready for fermentation. But now we have the choice of what vessel to use. So here you can see a couple of pictures. On the left is an example of a stainless steel vessel. Stainless steel is common for use in winemaking because it is inert. It's not going to add any flavor to the wine. So if you use stainless steel for your fermentation, all you're going to get are the flavors of the grape variety. Another option, as you can see here, is to use some sort of oak vessel. Oak is a type of wood that is widely used in winemaking, and it's used because it is not inert. If oak is used for alcoholic fermentation, the wine can potentially start to take some flavors from the oak, which are going to add to the complexity. So flavors from oak could be things like smoke or vanilla or coffee. It's going to depend according to exactly what type of oak you have. So both of those are an option. And then when fermentation has finished, we have the option of storage or maturation. So storage means normally a shorter amount of time in an inert vessel, like our stainless steel again, and the purpose here is actually not to change the wine too much. So it's just keeping the wine safe and ready for going into bottling. The other option is maturation, which is then putting wines into normally oak vessels for a longer amount of time. And as we've already said about oak is where you can gain more flavour. So if you're choosing to mature the wine in oak, it's normally with the purpose of getting some of those oaky flavours into the final wine. And then the final stage will be packaging. So here you can see a picture of some bottles. Again, something I'm sure you've come across many times, but bottles are not the only option. So here the winemaker could choose something like cans or bag-in-box. These are also becoming more popular these days. So different choices here again. Now here I've just got some pictures of some of the vessels that we've mentioned already, so you can see a little bit more what they look like in real life. Stainless steel we've mentioned already, so here you can see actually some pretty big stainless steel vessels. One of the useful things about stainless steel, as well as being inert, is that you can get them in an array of different sizes to suit your needs. Another useful thing, which is often quoted, is that stainless steel is just easy to clean. Now, this may not be your first thought when you're thinking about making a wine, but various people have said that 80 to 90% of winemaking is cleaning. So if that's going to be your job, you want to make sure that you've got something that's going to be easy to clean. The concrete option in the middle. So this is maybe a more traditional option, something that was more widespread before so many people use stainless steel. It's used because, again, it is inert. You're not going to get flavors from the concrete in the wine. But with concrete, it can be a little bit more difficult to manage because they're often lined with something like glass or tiles or resin to keep the wine separate from the surface of the concrete. So where this has been done, it is just going to take a little bit more maintenance, a little bit more care year on year. So for some people, it's considered not as easy as the steel option. And then here you can also see some oak barrels. So oak, as we've said already, is the not inert option. This is going to be the option where normally you're expecting to get some flavour, some change to the wine by putting it into oak vessels. Now here I'm just going to introduce to you a few other options which are more generally relevant to white wines. So there are a few other things the winemaker can do to control the style, the balance, the quality of the wine that they're trying to make. So the first of these is adjustments. And this means adjusting things like the sugar level or potentially the acid level in the grape juice before or during fermentation. Now, sugar level we mentioned already, that's going to be down to how ripe the grapes are when they're harvested. And acid level is something that's also going to be down to how ripe the grapes are. When we're talking about acids in wine, they are what give us that refreshing characteristic. However, you could potentially have too much or too little. So it's at this point that the winemaker can just change that slightly in order to make sure that the wine tastes good, that it's balanced overall. Other options that you can see here include malolactic conversion. So this is a process that would normally take place after the alcoholic fermentation. And it's a process that changes the acidity in the wine and also potentially adds some buttery flavors, hence the picture of some butter here. So it's an option for the winemaker as to whether they want this process to happen or not. And if they do, what we're going to get is a little bit softer acidity and potentially more buttery or creamy flavors. Lees contact is yet another option. So when we're talking about lees, this is the dead yeast cells after the fermentation has finished, which can form a little sediment, a little layer in the bottom of the vessel. If the winemaker chooses to keep the lees in contact with the wine, they can get a little bit more body, get more fullness to the wine, and also some different flavors again. Here we talk about flavors like biscuit, bread, brioche, hence the picture of some bread. Now, what's important to note is that both of these choices are independent of the choice of using oak or not. So you could get a wine that has some lees contact, but no oak or no malolactic conversion, or just malolactic conversion, or could be all three. So this is how the winemaker is going to build up the style that they're looking for. The final option we have here is sweetening. So when it comes to the sweetness level of the wine, there's a few ways that it can be controlled. But one of the things a winemaker can do at the end of fermentation is just to add something sweet to a dry wine. Often we're talking about sort of concentrated grape juice, sugars from grapes that are just going to bring a little bit of sweetness to the wine if desired. Next, we're going to talk about red wines. So when we're talking about red wines, we are now talking about making wines with black grapes. You can't do the same as what we said with white wines and make it out of both colours. If you're making a red wine, it has to be black grapes because it's the colour in the skins that we're looking to get into the wine. Not just the colour, but also the tannins and flavours that are in the skins. We want all of those in our final wine. So we need to keep the skins in contact with the juice. So this means that after crushing, where we split the skins to release the juice, we are going to go straight into alcoholic fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation is the same process once again. Yeast is going to eat the sugar, convert that into carbon dioxide and alcohol. But this time we actually have to work a little bit harder. So that carbon dioxide that's being produced during the fermentation is going to start pushing those skins up to the top of the vessel. So in the picture here, you can see they form a little layer on top of the juice if they are left undisturbed. And if you've got all the skins in a layer at the top, they are not going to be giving as much colour, as much flavour, as much tannin to the wine as we're looking for. So in our red wine fermentation, you can see, well, what these people are doing here in the picture. On the left, we've got some punching down, where from the top, this cap, this layer is broken up with an implement. Or on the right, we've got an example of pumping over. So here you can see a hose has been attached to the bottom of the vessel. The juice is drained from the bottom and then sprayed back over the top. Both are options of keeping that juice and skin thoroughly mixed together so we can get the flavours, colour, tannin that we're looking for. Another option to manage that extraction is the temperature. So when we're talking about temperatures for red wines, they are normally fermented at a warmer temperature compared to white wines because it's going to facilitate that extraction. And with white wines, what can be a concern is that if you have it too warm, you're going to lose some of the delicate flavours of the variety. So in that sense, you don't want to have normally a too warm white wine fermentation, but for red wines, it's fine. A bit warmer is okay. Most of the grapes can handle it. So after the fermentation has finished, all the skins are going to sink to the bottom of the vessel. And then you're going to have your wine sitting on top of it. So the wine can be drained from the vessel and separated. Then in the bottom, you're going to have your skins still with some wine mixed in. So it's this mixture of skins and wine that's left over that is then pressed. And again, you can see an example of a press here, same mechanism as what we said before, just keeping the skins inside and then allowing the wine to be separated outside. And then you can have both the drained wine and the pressed wine ready for either storage or maturation again. So same options apply. When we're thinking about red wines, we probably more often associate them with some sort of oak flavour. So you might find that more of the red wines that you come across do have some maturation in oak. And with red wine, sometimes this can be quite a long time, up to a couple of years, potentially, depending on the region, variety, style, and so on. But again, all of this is winemaker choice. And then once the wine is ready, after its required amount of storage or maturation, it will once again be packaged, shipped and sold to wherever it needs to go in the world. Now, what I wanted to do here is just talk a little bit more about oak. Oak is not just one choice, it is in fact many choices. So when the winemaker is deciding what sort of oak to use, here are some of the things that they could be thinking about. So on the left, you can see potentially different sizes of barrels. So in the picture here, we have some smaller barrels and some much larger ones. And the idea here is that the smaller the barrel is, you've got a greater surface area of wine in contact with wood, and that's going to give you more flavour. So the choice is essentially, if you want more oak flavour in your wine, you're normally going to go for a smaller barrel. If you want a bit less oak flavour, maybe you want it to be a little bit more subtle, then you could go for a bigger vessel instead. So that's one of the choices. Age of barrel is another one. The first time you use a barrel is when it has the most amount of flavour that it can potentially add to a wine. So a new barrel is going to have within the wooden staves more flavours that you're going to get in the final wine. You can use that barrel a second time, third time, fourth time, but each time you put a wine in it, it's going to have less and less flavour to impart. So here again, the choice is for the winemaker. Do they want lots of oak flavour, in which case probably new oak barrels are going to be better, or do they want a bit less? And really here again, winemakers will normally have a mixture of different ages. So you might have a proportion of new barrels and then some that are 2 or 3 years old. And then once the wine has finished maturing in all of those barrels, they can take it out of all of the different barrels, blend it together and get the desired flavour that they're looking for. Another option could be level of toasting. So when the barrels are being made, they're often held over a fire to help with the heating of the barrels, to help with the making it into the right shape. And at this time, you can then decide if you want your barrels to be at a light, medium, or heavy toast. And the more toasted the barrels are, the more sort of smoky, spicy flavors you can get in the final wine. So again, another choice. And then another one you can see here is type of oak. So here I'm thinking about where in the world has the oak been sourced from. So we broadly divide oak types into American and European. But even within Europe, we've got different forests which can have different qualities. So the source of the oak is also going to have an impact on the final style. So as you can see, yeah, it's quite complicated when we're talking about oak. Now, the final style of wine to mention was the rosé wine. So here, there are a couple of different ways of making a rosé wine. In some places, you can make a rosé wine just by mixing a red and a white wine together. It's going to give you a pink wine. It's not used in Europe, with a couple of exceptions, mainly because it seems to be better to make a red wine from black grapes instead. But you may find some examples of rosé wines out there, which are just white wines and red wines mixed. So what we're going to talk about here in more detail is the example of making a rosé wine just from black grapes. So here we start again with crushing the grapes, splitting the skin to release the juice. And we'll go into fermentation with the skins and juice together, or potentially we might just keep the skins and juice together before fermentation starts. Either way, the key is less time. If you have a shorter amount of time where the skins and juice are together, it means you're not going to extract as much colour or tannin. So by keeping them together for a short amount of time, we get a pink juice. And then when we're ready, we can drain that juice off. And then the wine is going to finish its fermentation, normally in stainless steel, where again, it can be stored before it's ready to be bottled. Now, you might notice here that we've not got the option of oak barrels as we saw for white wines and red wines. And that's because most of the rosé wines you're going to come across are not normally oak aged. Again, it's not impossible, it is still a choice. But for the most part, I'm sure most of the rosés you've come across are just, the aim is just for them to be fresh, fruity, to show that varietal flavour rather than to have lots of oak flavours. And then again, we get to the end and the wine is ready for packaging to be shipped and sold around the world. So that is a fairly brief run through of the different stages of the process and different orders of the process for making red, white and rosé wines. Got a few minutes for some questions now. So I'm just going to have a look in the Q&A. If anyone has any questions that they would like to add, please do so now, and I'll just spend a few minutes trying to go through them. So I've got a question here that says, where does blending fit in the process? Which is a really good question. So when we're talking about blending, this is really another way that we can get the wine to the desired style. So normally we're going to have a blend before bottling. So this could be taking maybe the different grape varieties or wines that have been aged in different barrels or whatever it might be, and we're getting them into the right proportion before we put the wine into the bottle. There are some producers who will also do a bit of blending before maturation as well. So there are potentially different stages in the process where blending can happen. Question here about oak. Which countries make oak? There's a lot of them. Oh, I just lose my presentation. Okay. Which countries make oak? America, mentioned already. France is a big one. Hungary, Slovenia, all different countries in Europe are quite famous for their oak. So yeah, lots of different options available. So we've got a question here about other options for making rosé, since there are several. Okay, we can do some more detail on rosé. So we mentioned blending a white wine and a red wine together to make a pink wine. We mentioned keeping the skins in contact with the juice. Now, if we dig a bit deeper into that option, there are sort of two schools of thought there. So when we're talking about keeping the skins in contact with the juice, this can either be done for a very short amount of time, or it can be done over a slightly longer amount of time. So if it's a very short amount of time, this is basically where the black grapes are being treated like white grapes. So you crush and press them very quickly, separate the juice, and due to that very quick process, you're really not going to get that much color coming from the skins. So this is known as direct pressing, and this would be then where you get very pale colored rosés. Another option would be, as I said, keeping the skins in contact longer, and that's generally known as short maceration. Some creative naming here. And with short maceration, because it's going to be keeping the skins in contact with the juice for a longer amount of time, could be a few hours, could be a couple of days potentially. This is going to give us a darker coloured rosé. And there is another type of production, which is known as saignée, or sort of bleeding. And this is where the rosé is made by taking some of the fermenting juice out of a red wine fermentation while it's in progress. So if you think about the red wine fermentation we were talking about, you've got skins and juice together. Over time, we're extracting lots of colour. If you take some of that juice out early, it's still going to be pink. And then that you can use to make a rosé. This one, the aim is slightly different in that traditionally places that use this did so to actually concentrate the red wines by creating a higher proportion of skins to juice. So by removing some of the juice, you're actually making a more concentrated red wine. And then you get a little rosé as a side effect, which, you know, why not? Everyone likes rosé. A question on why is white wine fermentation done only with juice? The reason for that is because the skins would change the flavors and also could add some tannins like we get in a red wine, which is not normally desirable. There are examples of white wines that are made with the skins, and those are the orange wines that were mentioned earlier. So if you've come across orange wines or skin fermented white wines, they do exist. There's not huge volumes of them available, but that would be the difference that you'd be expecting. Different aroma characteristics and slightly more of this kind of tannic, grippy sensation. We've got another question about the use of other woods, such as chestnut. Absolutely exists. I talked a lot about oak because that is the main type of wood used in winemaking. If I had to put a number to it, it would be over 95% of wood used in the world, probably even higher than that is going to be oak, but chestnut is a good option for otherwise, or acacia or cherry trees. There are some other types of woods that have been used in places before. So yeah, other options do exist. Got a couple of questions about malolactic conversion. So I'll just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So malolactic conversion, as I said, takes place in the wine after the alcoholic fermentation has finished. And what we see here is the action of bacteria on the malic acid in the fermented wine. And what we need to understand here is that malic acid is considered to be quite a sort of harsh green acid. It's the sort of acid you can find in kind of green apples. And bacteria will convert this malic acid into lactic acid. Lactic acid is much softer. It's the sort of acid you get in milk. And most of us don't think of milk as being particularly acidic. So by converting the malic acid into lactic acid, we are softening the overall perception of the acidity in the wine. And as I said, it can give more buttery, creamy flavors as well. So then to the other question of how it's controlled, it's then controlled by the winemaker deciding whether or not the bacteria are going to be essentially allowed access to the wine. So if the winemaker wants it to happen, then they're going to leave the wine normally at a sort of ambient temperature. They're going to either add malic acid bacteria or lactic acid bacteria, or potentially could just leave it open for the natural bacteria to do the job for them. And they're going to not add any antimicrobial agents. So if you want it to happen, you've got to do those things. If you don't want it to happen, then you do the opposite. So you would chill the wine down, you wouldn't leave it exposed to bacteria or add any bacteria, and then you would add an antibacterial, antimicrobial agent such as sulfur dioxide, and then that would protect the wine from any potential bacteria that may be in the area. Oh, more questions keep coming in. Should we talk about yeast, as we've just finished talking about bacteria? Why not? The question's, what are the pros and cons of natural yeast versus added yeast? And the answers are, of course, many and varied. So when we're talking about natural yeast, you may have heard of this as wild yeast or ambient yeast or potentially spontaneous yeast. So these are the yeasts that either live on the skins of the grapes or in the air or just on the surfaces of the vessels in the winery. People that use these yeasts, allow these yeasts to do the fermentation, would say that the benefits are extra complexity. You're going to have a different population of yeast in your winery compared to what's in your neighbour's winery, for example. So you're going to have a unique population of yeast, and the way that they ferment the wine is going to mean that your particular wine is going to be different to any other wine. The challenge with that, the cons, as you put it in the question, are that it can be less easy to control. So you might find that there are some unexpected flavors that pop up in there if you're going to have a unique population of yeast. You can also find that sometimes these yeast can be not as strong as commercial yeast. And they can then struggle a little bit in completing a fermentation. And then that's going to be a bit of a problem if you're looking at making a wine. If it doesn't complete, then yeah, you've got some issues there. So then in terms of commercial yeast, cultured yeast, cultivated yeast, again, whichever term you want to use, is going to be the opposite. So you have more control. You can buy your yeast to fit the style of wine that you're aiming to make. And yeast suppliers these days have many and varied options. You can buy yeasts that give you particular flavor characteristics if you're making an aromatic white wine, or if you're trying to make a more fruity red wine. You'll be able to pick the type of yeast that works for you. The criticism leveled against some of these yeasts is that they can be less complex, or across a region, if everyone's using the same type of yeast, you might find that the wines become a bit homogeneous. They lose a sense of individuality. But that is not to say that you cannot make individual wines with cultivated yeast. There is almost a bit of a middle ground here, where some producers will take the yeast from their wild fermentation. Yeast as a microorganism will reproduce during a fermentation, so you can actually take some of those yeast cells, send them to a lab where they will be propagated, and then you can buy your own yeast strain back year after year. So there you're getting a bit more control, because you know that you've selected a yeast strain that works well. You're not just relying on what happens to be in the air or on your vessels at the moment of fermentation, but it's going to be something particularly unique to your winery that you can then order again. Right, maybe time for one more question. Oh, there was another one, a follow-up about orange wines. Maybe let's finish on that, as we talked a bit about orange wines already. So the question is just, what regions other than Eastern Europe make orange wines? And the answer is pretty much everywhere, to be honest. I've sort of started earlier by saying that it's not a style that's as common, but I think the flip side of that could be to say it is a style that's quite trendy. So the home of orange wine is often considered to be Georgia or Armenia. There's a bit of debate about who did it first. In the question, it says Eastern Europe, and absolutely you can see these styles of wines in Eastern Europe as well. But more recently, across Italy, Spain, even some English orange wines. You may be able to find some of those if you look. And certainly in the States, in Australia, New Zealand, it's these days more a choice of each producer as to whether they want to make that style of wine, even though the history is more connected to particular parts of Europe. And again, if it is something you're interested in, I do recommend trying to find one. It is completely different to what you'd expect from a white wine. Okay, so I know there's a few more questions, and sorry I haven't had a chance to get through all of them, but I think we will call it a day there, otherwise I might start going down some really specific wormholes. So the last thing for me to say is thank you for joining. If you haven't done already, my colleague sent up a feedback poll, so please do fill that in. If there's anything you'd like to watch again as part of the recording, this will be made available on YouTube along with all of our videos, including the one on orange wine. And if anyone is interested in a course, you can find the Where to Study page on the WSET Global website. So thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. See you next time.